introduce. My name is Sylvan Soloway, and I'm an alumna of both the College of Arts and Science and Steinhardt. I'm also the Director of Career Services and an adjunct professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at NYU. So I'm delighted to introduce today's presenters, my colleagues, Dr. Perri Klass, who is a professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University and co-director of NYU Florence. She attended Harvard Medical School and completed her residency in pediatrics at Children's Hospital in Boston. She writes a weekly column, The Checkup, for the New York Times Science section. She has written extensively about medicine, children, literacy, and knitting. Her new book, A Good Time to Be Born: How Science and Public Health Gave Children a Future, is an account of how victories over infant and child mortality have changed the world. Also, we have some great news. Perri has just been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Science, one of the most prestigious scholarly societies. So welcome, Perri.
Thank you very much.
I also would like to welcome my colleague, Dan Fagin. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who writes frequently about environmental science. Dan Fagin is also a science journalism professor at New York University, and he runs our SHERP program, which is Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting. His book, his best-selling book, Tom's River, A Story of Science and Salvation, was awarded the 2014 Pulitzer for general nonfiction, as well as the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism, the National Academy Science Book Award, and the Society of Environmental Journalists Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award, among others. So thank you all so much for joining us. Dan and Perri, I'll let you all take it away.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Sylvan. And hi, Perri.
Hi, Dan.
You know, we don't have faculty meetings in person anymore, so this is the way we have to communicate for at least a few more months.
Let me just also tell everybody who's here, if you have questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. And toward the end, we'll take some time to call on some of those questions.
Great. Yeah, please do ask those questions. And I know it's confusing because you want to use the chat box, but use the Q&A box and it'll be easier for Sylvan to keep track. So we'll be sure to leave time. But I know I've got some questions I want to ask Perri because I loved her book so much. And, you know, I really didn't know what to expect, but it was a delight, both heartbreaking and really inspiring. So I truly enjoyed it, and I'm just bursting with questions. But first, I just want to congratulate Perri on her recent admission to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Sylvan mentioned it, but for those of you who don't know, it's really a very august group. It was founded by John Adams and John Hancock, among others, so it goes way back. And I would say that Perri's addition, along with Ta-Nehisi Coates, another colleague of ours, is certainly classing the place up. So congratulations, Perri.
Thank you, thank you.
So, and while we're talking about the literary world, your book, one of the many striking things about it is it is just packed with wonderful quotes and literary allusions. Everyone from Harriet Beecher Stowe to Mary McCarthy, wrote the group. I've been to Perri and Larry's apartment, and it is packed with books, like you might expect. But wow, you are truly one of the best read people I know, and I know a lot of well-read people. So how did you go about, putting this thing together, and why did you make the decision to bring in so many both nonfiction and fictional writers? And I guess, Perri, how does that relate to your longtime advocacy of reading? I mean, that's always been a big part of your life as a parent, but also as a volunteer for Reach Out and Read, which I hope you'll explain what that is.
There are so many good questions wrapped up in that. I'm not sure where to start, but I'll pull at it from several different directions. So first of all, I think you're right. Reading is kind of how I understand the world. Reading and sometimes writing, and you probably understand this yourself. Writing is sometimes the way that I think about and understand problems that are difficult for me, or other people's lives and experiences, and reading is as well. Reach Out and Read, which Dan mentioned, is a national nonprofit organization which promotes early literacy, works through the pediatric clinics where children get their checkups, to talk to parents about the importance of looking at books with young children, starting at birth, right through infancy, when the baby's chewing on the board book, right through the toddler years, and we give books at those visits. It's a very wonderful way to practice pediatrics. It's a very wonderful message to be able to offer parents. And it's also a way of encouraging those incredibly important early relationships, the back and forth, the parent and child. So it's something that's, as you say, been very important to me as a pediatrician as well. But to come back to the question then that you asked about this book, part of what this book was about for me was trying to understand, yes, the science, the medicine, the public health, which goes into bringing down kind of routine, expected infant and child mortality, which was present all through history. And my book is mostly concerned with the last 150 years, when there's such a dramatic change. But I didn't want to stop with the science and the medicine. One of the things which was driving me all along was trying to understand the experience of being a parent, the experience of being a pediatrician, the experience of living in a world in which you had to accept that a substantial number of infants and children would not make it. And one of the ways that I understand that is through people's real memoirs and accounts of their lives. But another way that I think you understand that is by looking at how those children's illnesses and deaths occur matter-of-factly in novels. Kind of the way that the culture reflects that reality, that many children die. Did John Adams have children who you mentioned, children who died at infancy? Yes, everybody did. It was part of everybody's life. How does that show up on the stage, in poetry, in painting? And how does the world change as we move across the 20th century for the first time in human history to an expectation that children should not die?
Yeah, it was so striking to me. Just, it's so effective the way you tee us up beautifully for the successes later by just writing about the misery before, and you could have called this, instead of A Good Time to Be Born, here it is. You could have called this a really terrible time to be born for most of human history. Although, maybe that's not really fair, because the expectation it was simply part of the expectation that people would die. And
go ahead. I was going to say people had different expectations, not just about the death of children, but also about the possibility of death from many things in adulthood. Go on.
Right.
I cut you off.
Right. One of the things that struck me is that people reacted to that extreme trauma in different ways. Some sort of turned inward, and some used that experience and sort of turned it into amazing work that came afterwards. Tell us about Josephine Baker. This is not the jazz singer and dancer at the Folies Bergère. Yes. This is a different Josephine Baker, who I was just fascinated by the story of her and her contributions, and her big revelation that, prevention actually works.
So Josephine Baker is a phenomenal figure. She's a doctor whose memoir I read, Fighting for Life. She's a public health figure, with a interesting backstory. She's a young woman from a good family who hadn't necessarily planned on having a career, but finds herself needing to support some of her relatives, goes to medical school in the later part of the 19th century, practices for a while as a physician, and then gets involved in New York City in the beginnings of the public health movement and the movement to reduce infant mortality. And one of the reasons that she's interesting is she's got an unbelievably distinctive voice in her memoir. She's, it's like having somebody take you through the story, whether she's writing. It was an appalling summer. This is 1902, with an average of 1,500 babies dying each week in the city. Lean, miserable, wailing little souls carried off wholesale by dysentery. And she writes about climbing stair after stair, knocking on door after door, met drunk after drunk. Filthy mother after filthy mother, and dying baby after dying baby. It was the hardest physical labor I ever did in my life, just backache and perspiration and disgust and discouragement and aching feet. Anyway, but she writes in the same way about this amazing revelation, which strikes her that the way to keep babies from dying is to keep them from getting sick, and that this notion of prevention, and what she does about the summer diarrhea, for example, is she recruits the school nurses because they're not working during the summer. And that's a New York public health innovation already by itself at the beginning of the 20th century. These school nurses who are meeting the children of the tenements where they are in the schools. But she has them going into people's homes over the summer, encouraging breastfeeding, talking about hygiene, talking about ventilation and opening the windows, encouraging the parents. And at the end of the experiment, what she says is we had learned something. Heat did not necessarily kill babies. And so if the doctor and the future director of the Bureau of Child Health, which New York was the first one in the country, if that's news to her, that heat doesn't necessarily kill babies, that there are things that parents can do, that's a really important message for the doctors and the nurses to learn, but also to communicate to the parents who love their children dearly, but have not gotten this message that they can prevent these illnesses and these deaths. And remember that in 1902 and even in 1910, she doesn't have antibiotics. She doesn't have the treatments for childhood diarrhea and dysentery that we have now. She doesn't have immunization. So you're doing this by enlisting the parents, by education, by encouragement. You're doing that with these public health nurses, and you're making a tremendous difference. But there's also a message that's changing for parents in terms of what you as a parent can do. And I guess the reason I keep coming back to this is I'm so struck. It's not that this was something the doctors knew and they had to educate them. It's something the doctors and the nurses were learning.
Right. Yeah, and to us, through the 21st century eyes, it seems obvious, but it's never obvious at the time. And I see this in environmental health. People are really slow to grasp prevention as opposed to treatment. There's less money there's less money to be made, and a lot more money that needs to be invested in prevention. People have to change their lives to prevent in a way that they really don't on treatment. And it really requires a fundamental shift in thinking that we haven't completely made 100 years later.
And it also requires, what she's talking about here initially is, educating parents. But of course, with any kind of prevention, you very quickly get from that to the idea that if people are living in dangerous, difficult circumstances, it's not just an individual decision. Yes, I will breastfeed my baby. Yes, I will open the window. That's good. But then you come back to who's responsible for these conditions. What should you, to put an obvious question, are you going to require that milk be pasteurized? Now, Louis Pasteur had invented pasteurization decades before that, but it's not till 1908 that the first American city requires that milk be pasteurized. So one of the things about prevention is it takes you very quickly. You can think about personal responsibility, but you have to start thinking about the larger issues of advocacy and social responsibility. And I'll just say that one of the things I felt reading about this and writing this book was a sense of how, at least for pediatrics in the United States, that sense of the social context and social responsibility was kind of in there from the beginning, not always, didn't always get it right, not with everyone, but that sense that the baby in your exam room can't have walked in on his own steam, that there's always a social context, a family, a question of poverty, a question of what kind of supports, of whether, you can't just say breastfeed that baby if there's a mother who, in order to keep the family fed, had to go back to work and there's no accommodation being made. And so I think that one of the other places that prevention takes you very quickly is to that social context. And
it makes you face those really big, tough questions. Who's going to pay for this? And are we willing to, compel people to do things that maybe they don't necessarily want to do, at least not initially? Before we leave Josephine behind, just as an aside, you mentioned in your acknowledgments that your daughter, Josephine, played a big role in this book. In fact, you said it wouldn't have existed without her.
Yes.
First of all, I suspect it's not a coincidence that she's named Josephine. Is that correct?
Well, she's actually named for Little Women, although I have
Joe.
I had not read Josephine Baker, but as I'm reading Josephine Baker, I'm thinking, oh, good choice.
Yeah, so tell us about her role. I always think it's interesting how authors interact with their families, their spouses and their kids and their parents as they're working on these massive projects.
Well, this was a new kind of book for me, partly because it involves the historical research, which, it's not journalism about American medicine as it is today or about my own experience. And so on the one hand, I found that intimidating, but on the other hand, I found it intoxicating. And every single chapter in this book, I thought, oh, this could be a book. This could be a book. There should be a whole book. And in some cases, there were several really good books. And this question, there were moments when I would say to myself, this book should be 9 volumes long because there are so many great stories I'm not telling. And how can I be writing this book about the decline in infant and child mortality and not paying attention to the people who repair congenital heart disease? And there should be a whole book about that. And she's a very good editor. And I think she quite literally edited each part of the book, but also helped me figure out how to set those limits and put these pieces together so that it would work for an intelligent, educated reader who was not a doctor. I was constantly asking her, do you already know this story? Do you know the maternal mortality story? Do you know what are the stories that everybody already knows? And actually, one of the things that when you're in a field is you kind of lose that perspective. What do I have to explain? Do I have to explain why diarrhea kills babies? Yes, I do. Do I have to explain about death in childbirth? Yes, I do. And all of those questions. And she was always there.
Every author needs someone like that. And it can be fraught to have it be someone from your family, but it sounds like you guys worked that out. I thought that the book moved really briskly. Somebody, I don't know who gets the credit, you or Josephine, or probably both of you. It's just packed with nuggets, though. It's very complete. I kept waiting. Okay, where's Dr. Spock? When's Dr. Spock going to show up? And he shows up, and you're having dinner with him. And that sounded like a neat story. Dr. Spock looms so large for our parents' generation and to some extent for us too. But he wasn't perfect. His initial advice was to have babies sleep on their stomachs, right? And of course, that was the wrong idea. Ultimately,
Dan, when I started out in practice in the 1980s, that was the advice we were giving. I must have given it. I know because my older 2 children who followed it, and but so yes, it's one of the jobs you always have in medicine is wonder what are you saying that will turn out to have been the wrong thing to say, as
Right.
you know.
Right. And that makes the communications task so much harder because, of course, the fact that science, if it's done right, is self-correcting, that, all knowledge is provisional, and we're always looking for new evidence, and good scientists and good science journalists too are constantly willing, open, and even eager to change their minds based on the evidence. But that can come at a cost of trust and credibility sometimes, which makes the communication that much more challenging.
And especially perhaps in medicine, I mean, the lesson we learn over and over is don't present yourself as all-knowing, all-powerful, with access to a secret source of, information that cannot be argued with. Explain why you think what you think, explain how you know what you know. Don't be afraid to say, this is what I'm doing with the people who I love best, because I think this is really what we know. But you're absolutely right. I mean, science journalists, medical journalists, doctors, scientists get excited when it turns out there's new information, when it turns
out
that something wrong and we've figured out how to make it better. But you have to be careful how you explain that so that it's the excitement that comes across and not the fact that there's always more to learn, it being turned into something which makes you doubt what you already know.
Yeah. There are incredibly obvious and powerful implications for what we're going through right now. But before we talk about that, I don't want to leave some of these historical nuggets behind quite yet. They're just too good. And there were so many little wows in this book and some big ones. And one of them for me was this idea of the child hatcheries, these exhibits at World's Fairs, of little babies in primitive incubators, and sort of the weird combination of, there was some good public health instruction going on, but there was also bizarre voyeurism going on. It was kind of a mishmash. But I thought that you explained that really brilliantly, and well, tell us more about these child hatcheries.
So again, I have to say there are whole books about this. One of the things that I was writing about was that a lot in the second half of the 20th century, as we're seeing infant and child mortality come down, one of the real frontiers is around the newborn period. And in fact, today, when we look at infant mortality in this country and in most other countries, most of it is not, it's not just that most child mortality these days is infant mortality, that is to say it's in the first year of life, but most infant mortality is neonatal mortality. It's in the first month of life. If you look at the causes of death that people are still dealing with, many of them are related to prematurity, are related to problems that occur during pregnancy, are related to things that, connect to the facts of childbirth and the problems. So,
and you have a very, very brilliant way of explaining that. You characterize it as like a liminal zone, which in the environmental field, we're really interested in those sort of edge areas, the areas of uncertainty where you don't know which way things are going to go. And you make the really wonderful point that there's a reason why the bris is not immediately after the child is born, or the naming ceremony in some African traditions, because we don't know how things are going to turn out.
I mean, I think a number of people have argued that many traditions don't mark the existence of a new baby until the baby is about a week old, as with a bris, as with a naming ceremony, and that what these rituals take cognizance of is that many babies don't make it out of the delivery room, or they don't make it past that first week of life. And one of the things I was interested in, of course, was, how do parents handle that? How do people kind of how do you feel with as you go through the pregnancy? How do you manage it? Do you name the baby? Do you reuse the name if the baby dies, which of course was a not uncommon habit. So I wanted a way to think about what happens around newborn medicine. And this particular Dr. Cooney, who Dawn Raffel has a book called The Incubator Show, and argues that probably was not a medical doctor, but he was a showman. And this phenomenon of having incubators, and into the 40s, there were incubators at Coney Island with premature infants on display for people to look in and see these miraculously small babies in their incubators. It did a great deal to publicize the idea of the incubator. And as you say, the care was good. I mean, there were problems one place or another, but they had nurses. There's a whole population of children who started out as babies in those incubators. One of the things and then you get into the interesting question of the science. What were those incubators providing? We're not talking ventilators. That's not going to come until the 1960s, 70s, much later. But so these in the 20s, 30s, 40s, these incubators are providing temperature control, hygiene, and it's sort of an interesting question because if you look at the graph of infant mortality in this country across the first half of the 20th century, it drops like a ski slope.
That's amazing.
In 1915, when my grandmothers were having their children, when my parents were being born in Brooklyn, in 1915, we are losing at least 100 out of every 1,000 live newborns don't make it to the first birthday, at least 1 in 10, and probably a little more, and probably more if you're poor or in a otherwise marginalized community. But even if you've got the best medical care there is, you're probably still losing something like 1 in 10. And it drops until by the 1950s, before you've got modern neonatology, before you can intubate and ventilate premature babies, you're still losing. It's down below, it's dropped by more than half that. You're talking more like maybe losing 30, 35 out of every 1,000 newborns. That's a big change.
Tremendous. And, again, it's one of those things that we all kind of know, but what your book really drives home to me is that it's not just a change in numbers. It echoes across society in these fascinating ways. I just kept thinking about that, and we just don't stop to think about what that kind of a profound change means. We just don't.
I agree, and I just want to say, Dan, that sometimes when you read a biography of an important figure, John Adams, it'll sometimes be in a footnote or in a parenthesis, they had 5 children, but 3 died in infancy. And then the narrative will continue as if, this is just to be noted, and not always, but I think for me, I'll just say one thing. When I trained in pediatrics in the 1980s in Boston, first of all, you went into pediatrics in part because it was a happy specialty. Lots of good endings, lots of miracles that could be accomplished, even with the sickest kids, even in oncology, even in cardiology with congenital defects. It was a happy specialty. And second of all, the overriding ethos of my training was the children should not die. If a child comes into the emergency room, previously well child, and dies, something went wrong. Where there's safety things that we could put in place, or what's the right way? Children should not die. You would never have sort of looked around and said, oh well, but 100 out of every 1,000 or how. But a couple of generations earlier, when physicians were regularly dealing with everyone gets measles, polio, meningitis before there were antibiotics, you could not have practiced pediatrics if your idea was that no one would ever die. It wouldn't have worked.
Right. I've always seen these analogies to my own field and my own work that, my last book was about childhood cancer. Yeah. And it was largely about this period of intense activism about environmental causation and cancer. That's really lost a lot of steam these days. And I'm totally convinced that the reason is because survival rates are so much higher. We have so much better treatment level, treatment modalities than we had in the 70s and 80s when a lot of the events of my last book take place. So there are these interesting ripples.
But it may also come back to what you were saying before about prevention. You have the heroic cure in which you can battle back for that child, but the work of prevention is different in its difficulty.
So we're going to switch to questions in 5 minutes. And by the way, I just wanted to encourage everyone, again, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box. And Sylvan is coming through your questions, and we'll take the reins in a few minutes and get to your questions. But we've made it this far without talking about COVID-19, but we really can't ignore it. I felt its presence on every page of the book. I mean, I really did. Even though you don't talk about it that much explicitly in the book, you do in a few places. But one of the contrasts that struck me is that in previous generations seemed a lot more trusting about public health interventions, less resistant to vaccination, at least that's the way it appears, and other basic public health measures, preventative measures that are the equivalent of today's masking. So I guess what I'm wondering is that, do you think that in some ways public health today is the victim of its own successes, in the sense that people have the expectation that if they get COVID, it's no big deal because now, we have the expectation of survival. Maybe not a year ago, by the way, but, and on the other hand, we seem to have developed this intense suspicion of authority and of interventions. And that's, it's bipartisan, by the way. Some of the strongest resistance to childhood vaccination has come from certain elements of the left in a misguided belief that, we should handle pathogenic bacteria and other microbes in the most natural way possible. So this, as I was reading this book, I just kept thinking COVID. What do you think we can do about this sort of climate of suspicion and resistance to interventions? And what did you learn from this book that you think is applicable to what we're dealing with today with this pandemic?
Those are great questions. And I think I would start by saying that, writing this book and thinking about COVID obviously reminded me that though I think this is a very optimistic book, I think it's a celebration of human progress, you can't ever say, well, and here we are now and the job is done. And there are many reasons you can't say that about infant and child mortality. You can't say it because of the disparities which persist globally and in our own country between groups. You can't say, I mean, there's always work to do. You should never say, here I am on the top of the mountain, we're done. But COVID and the pandemic has also been an experience for all of us in the world of understanding the complexity of the microbial world, the complexity of our interactions, the vulnerability of our society, the way that infectious diseases take advantage of everything that we do, how we travel, how we don't travel, how we behave, how we manage our environment. All of that is something we have to keep learning and be humble about. So there's that piece and the sense that in fact we are living at a time when we've been reminded both of our vulnerability, our setting in a world of microbes, and also of our interconnections with one another. But all of the things we've been talking about reverberate in a COVID moment. So for example, you sort of talked about learning new things. We've just been through the Johnson & Johnson vaccine pause, in which the public health authorities had to make the decision to be transparent about very rare but worrisome cases and then figure out how to explain what they were doing. And then, people in pediatrics might have said, look, the system works. The system picks up even very rare questions. Isn't it great that the system works? But is that the message that comes across? So there's nothing we've talked about that you can't find and think about in this pandemic. For me, the message of this book is about what we've got going for us as humans. And what I say about this is that what we've done, made ourselves into a species in which we do not expect children to die, in which we actually, as parents, as pediatricians, as a society, we expect children to live, to grow up. There are accidents, there are tragedies, but our expectation is that the children we love will survive and grow. That we've done, we didn't do that in a particular campaign. It wasn't a single crusade. It's not like, let's fight polio. That's part of it. There are so many parts of it. There's public health, there's advocacy, there's individual scientific achievement, people in the virology lab, but also political advocacy, parent activism. And when you look at it all together, it's a kind of astonishing achievement that we've created at least the possibility of a world in which we can look at the children we love and expect them all to grow up. And we should appreciate our cleverness, all the different kinds of human cleverness, coordination, scientific cooperation, even while we understand our fallibility. And I think that, don't you think as a science journalist that that's part of the narrative of this terrible pandemic year?
Yeah, I think it should be, and I do think there's some recognition and appreciation that the development of the vaccines, especially the mRNA vaccines, that was a truly remarkable achievement, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It built on decades of amazing work by all sorts of people. But it is incredible what we can do, what we are capable of doing, and your book is very much a reminder of that. And the current moment that we're living in is a reminder of that. And it's also a reminder of how fallible we can be, how capable, how we struggle with the idea of short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. And that's the story of humanity is, can we think this thing through, please, and do what's best for all of us in the long run? And it's not always clear that we can, but sometimes we can. And your book certainly expresses that, I think.
Thank you. And I think the other thing that you just said, which is really profoundly true, which I kept thinking I was learning in this book, is look, the way you keep children safe is not by digging a moat. The way you keep your children safe is not by, digging a moat around your house, child-proofing your house and saying, okay, whatever's going on out there in the world, my child is safe. That doesn't work. In order to keep children, the way you make children safe is you make more children more safe in your community, in your country, in your world. This sort of something that we've had to learn over and over, and it's not always an easy lesson for us to learn in this pandemic, is that sense of connectedness. At any moment when somebody said, phew, that's happening over there, it's not about, my family, my town, my state, my country, you were wrong.
And by the way, that's not just about extending care to the other side of the tracks. It's also about changing our minds, changing our hearts. As Perri's book points out, brilliantly, systemic racism in healthcare is not just about inequitable distribution of funds. It's about much more than that. And this book will make you think, as we all should every day, about that. So with that, looks like there's some wonderful questions teed up, and I will turn things over to Sylvan. Take it away.
Thank you, Dan. So our first question is from Jeffrey Davis, who asks, what is the impact on children whose parents and caregivers are excessively busy and have less reading time with the child? He says in this vein, what if retired people volunteered to read with these children, either via internet perhaps rather than in person. Would such a program help?
Oh, so this is coming back to reach out and read. And I warn you, I can talk about reading to children and reach out and read. But I think, what I should say about that is that the interactions and reading with children is wonderful. And we've certainly seen this year some of what you can do over the internet within a family and with friends. What we're focusing on, though, in Reach Out and Read is those first 5 years of life. And so we're talking more, especially in the first 3 years of life, about the people who are actually taking care of a baby, taking care of a toddler. They're the ones that we're seeing in the exam room, and we're trying to use the books as a way of encouraging them, for example, to use that caretaking time, that bedtime time, that getting dressed time as the time for back and forth, for language, for interactions, because that's how you build brains in early childhood.
So the goal there is to get the caregivers, the parents, to be the
parents, the caregivers, the other family members, the people who are with the child. But obviously there's a role also for the educators and for the other important adults in a child's life. But often we're talking about a toddler, a child who's going to do better with an in-person interaction.
So our next question comes from Regina Snow Mandel. She says, in Massachusetts in the 1980s, there was a program called Project Good Health based on the federal early periodic screening and diagnosis program known as EPSTD. Outreach was a big issue, and the Commonwealth was sued unsuccessfully by legal services. Do you happen to know what happened to EPSTD?
Well, we still have that periodicity schedule that you're talking about. It's still very important in pediatrics, and it's another example of what Dan was talking about, where there's constantly new evidence about what kind of interventions when are most important for children. I don't know that particular lawsuit story, but the idea of all pediatric care, especially well care, is delivered according to a schedule that's informed by the different needs and issues as children grow and develop. Just to add a parenthesis, it's the really cool thing about pediatrics, that your patients grow and change. That if that the child who you see at the newborn visit will be the child who's running around your exam room as a toddler will be the child, and what you need to think about and worry about and do by way of help and intervention is going to change. Children are always moving targets.
The next question comes from Ruth Happel. She says she met you in Costa Rica during a course something like 40 years ago and has been following your work ever since. Her question is, there was a lot of research in how lower infant and child mortality helps lower birth rates and improve quality of life in less developed countries. This can be important in terms of broader ecological issues such as lowering deforestation and other habitat destruction because of continued income inequality, both in the US and worldwide. What would be best to ensure a continuation of these trends, since it has global impacts on human and ecosystem health?
Well, hi, Ruth. This is a question from somebody who I met when I thought I was going to be a parasite biologist, and we were wandering around in the rainforest. But it's a great question, because one of the things she points to is that we learn over and over and over again that the way that when infant and child mortality drops, people limit their family size. They can believe that the children will live to grow up. It changes everything. And just as we learn over and over and over again, say that investing in education for women and in literacy programs for women and for mothers helps lower infant and child mortality, and it also helps people decide to limit their family size. And that, as you say, has really important environmental implications. And I'll just say that this is a moment, this COVID moment, when everyone is worried about, people are worried about vaccination programs worldwide, which have brought down the global infant and child mortality rate. People are worried about the economic stress on families and whether that's going to have, again, an impact in how children's nutrition, children's medical care. The gains in infant and child mortality don't just transform life in a few well-to-do families, they transform the world. Believing that your children, expecting that your children should live to grow up changes everything. And so I would say, and this is something that we're hearing again and again, this is a moment to remember how connected we are. This is a moment to remember that what happens in one part of the world makes a difference everywhere, and to make sure that we don't lose these very essential gains. We're all worried about immunization rates in communicable diseases. We're all worried about children losing opportunity for education. Those worries and that investment needs to be international now more than ever.
And Sylvan, if I could just add one thing on that topic, and that is that, it was dogma 30, 40 years ago that world population would increase at an exponential rate, and that the limiting population growth was the single most critical challenge that we faced. Now we know, as Perri pointed out, that giving access women to education and control of their own bodies, including birth control, makes a profound difference in limiting increases in population, including in some developed countries. And then instead, what we really should be worrying about is resource use. What are our own environmental footprints, our own individual environmental footprints. And this is a profound change, and a real reckoning for the planet. And it is a direct result of what Perri writes about in this book, the ability, once parents realize that 1 out of 4 children were not fated to die, that they thought about their families in a profoundly different way. And it has led to a whole series of really interesting shifts in how we deal not just with public health, but also with environmental challenges. And they're all interconnected in fascinating ways.
Great. Our next, thank you, Dan. Our next question comes from our colleague, Robert Boynton. He says, what were the social and cultural implications of a world in which children died so frequently? And mentions in Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, he intimates that the poor are inured to death because it happens so frequently.
So I don't think anyone was ever inured to childhood death. It's something which, going back further in history, is sometimes discussed, the complicated questions of how you understand parental emotion. But honestly, I think you can find those expressions of desperate grief pretty much going back as far as you look. And you know that going back far enough into the historical record, one of the things you often lose is the voices of the mothers or the voices of the women who are actually caring for the children. But even so, in the voices of the fathers, in the voices that you do have, I don't think anyone was ever inured. That's different from what Dan brought up before. That is to say, the idea that infancy and childhood is in fact a liminal and a dangerous zone, that you have these children, that you love these children, but that you may not be able to keep them with you. And I think that's a different thing. It doesn't mean that, when you look at the stories from the 19th century, from the early 20th century, when you look at the letters that mothers write to the Government Child Bureau asking questions, They're grieving babies who died at birth or in infancy. They're beginning to hope that there might be something they could do, but I don't think anyone ever gets used to it. When you read Josephine Baker talking about working in the tenements of New York, she's talking about the grief, but she's talking about the grief of people who don't believe that there's anything they can do. And one of the reasons that I return in my book to the question of the reality that although it's worse to be poor and the risks are higher and the death rates are consistently higher among Blacks than among whites, as they still are, even after they've come down, but that nobody is safe. And so when you look at an example, like, for example, John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in history, the first billionaire, he founds the Rockefeller Institute when his beloved grandson dies of scarlet fever at the very beginning of the 20th century, because, as my grandmother would say, even if you're John D. Rockefeller, even if you're the president of the United, whoever you are, there is nothing you can do to keep a beloved small child safe. We live in a world where they're in this liminal zone. And if you go further back in history, and I'll just say this and then I'll stop, one of the images which comes up repeatedly meant to comfort parents is the idea that this beautiful child whom you love has been lent to you by God, but you knew all along that this child really wasn't yours. So how can you complain when the person who lent you this child, or the being who lent you this child, takes the child back? You should be saying, you know, thank you for what you lent me, thank you for what I had. But the very frequency with which that's repeated makes it pretty clear that for a lot of parents, even if they think that's what they should feel, it's not easy to summon those feelings.
Right. Just one quick comment about that too, that, you know, Rob pointed out Orwell's comments. I mean, my memory is that Orwell spent some time in Paris living among the poor, you know, relatively brief amount of time, and, you know, spent the rest of his career, you know, sort of writing as a supposed tribune of the underclass. And in some ways he was. But we should just keep in mind who is telling the story. And most of the time, the people telling the story about the poor are not poor. And, you know, that kind of stereotyping that, you know, the poor are inured, the poor don't really feel this, they're used to it. You know, that is a trope, a really venal trope that has everything to do with who's actually telling the story.
Interesting. Thank you. Let's go to the next question from Mike V. I wonder if your research has unearthed any data regarding the long-term prospects for child health in developed nations, given the increasing prevalence of obesity and overwhelmingly sedentary lifestyles.
Well, every era sets you its medical problems. I just have to say, I'm exactly the right age to have started medical school and heard a sort of, I don't know, infamous presentation, and I'll tell you why it was infamous, in the first week, in which somebody basically said to us as new medical students at the beginning of the 1980s, guys, infectious disease has been solved. Your job is to solve the so-called diseases of civilization, you know, the chronic diseases of sedentary lifestyle. That's your challenge. Infectious disease, that's so last century. And then, of course, right at the moment before we would become aware of HIV and AIDS. And, you know, it's kind of like, if this was a horror movie, you would have that creepy music in the background as we were listening to that lecture. So, you know, it's not either or. We have to, and the COVID pandemic has certainly shown that, we have to look at the infections that we deal with in the context of how we're living, how we're eating, how we're traveling. And those are hugely important questions. But I mean, I will say they are not questions that medicine will solve unilaterally. It comes back to what Dan was saying earlier, I think. It comes back to the question of working together, prevention, education, thinking about the impact of what we do on other people, on the environment. And for that reason, I'm going to ask Dan to say something about it too.
No, I thought you said it really well, Perri, and we shouldn't pretend that these are somehow easy choices. They're hard. They require constraints on our liberties, and they require investments. They require us to pay taxes because these are public. Many of these problems can really only be addressed as truly public health investments. And we wrestle with this problem, especially in the United States, where we have this tradition of individuality and individual liberty and self-reliance, or so we tell ourselves. This is a real problem for us. And you could see the best of us and also the worst of us this past year. Our sort of national characteristics, if there are such things. You can interpret the last year in a lot of ways. There were wonderful things that happened and really horrible things that have happened, terrible failures and also great triumphs. And again, to get back to Perri's book, one of the things about Perri's book that I really appreciated is that she was willing to dive into the complexity and say that, this was not one campaign, it wasn't one person, it wasn't one idea. The way history really works is that lots of things are happening simultaneously and sometimes contradictory, and sometimes there's confluence, but it's messy and imperfect. And certainly the last year has been like that as well.
Do we have time for a few more questions? Let's go to Carla Shepard-Rubenger's question. She says that COVID-19 has taught us many things. One is the value of telemedicine, and she was hoping you could address some of the new benefits that we've learned.
So it's certainly true that, and I mean, it's not medicine. Look at us here. We are for all of our many, many faults, kind of clever and innovative problem-solving species, right? Different kinds of problem solving. That's kind of what we do. Look at us here having a book event on Zoom. 2 years ago, I don't think I would have known what you meant if you said that. Look at the ways that family connection and education have managed to work remotely. And that's also true in medicine. And the place where it may turn out to be most powerful, to come to another issue for children's health that we haven't touched on, but that everyone, not just in pediatrics, but outside, is very worried about, it, mental health. Mental health services, there's never been enough for children to get everything that they need. There have always been disparities. And we're all very worried about children with mental health needs now coming out of this strange year and how we're going to meet those needs. And that's a place where telemedicine may make a tremendous difference. We've all learned to do, we improvise. I think that we've all learned to do more than we thought we could do remotely, but we've also learned some of the things that you really want to do in person. When you put your hands on that newborn baby and sort of assess the baby's muscle tone and that sort of overall sense of well-being. So you do what you can, but it helps you figure out what you really want to keep, hold on, and accommodate. And that's a good lesson. I think everybody in medicine feels that without a pandemic, trying to advance things along in telemedicine would have taken years and years and intense bureaucratic process, and we needed to do it because there was a pandemic, and in many cases we did it.
And by the way, a lot of us feel that we hope that the same kind of reassessment will be happening with other ways that we live our lives. Do we need to travel? What is travel for exactly? And what about, the amount of shopping that we do? What about how frequently we throw out our food? or reusing products. And the pandemic it's an inflection point, right? It's a moment when everything can be reconsidered, including medicine, right? The practice of medicine, but also including how we live. And we hope that we won't. We all are desperate to return to normal, but it will be a new normal, and that's good. We want it to be a new normal. We hope to be a more thoughtful normal. That's what we're aspiring to, and I very much hope that happens.
We have time for one more question. Darshana asks, what would you say that mental health issues are on the rise among children? And she also wanted to thank you both for this wonderful discussion.
There's been a general sense in recent years that we are finding more mental health issues among children. That in part may have to do with asking, that in part may have to do with destigmatizing those issues. So it's not just that we routinely are asking everybody from a certain age now about mental health, then about emotion and about depression. There's also really important work around helping children and adolescents feel comfortable telling you or telling someone. So the destigmatizing is really important, the asking is really important, but people have just been through a really hard year. And I think both for adults and for children, it's really, really necessary to find ways to get help to the people who are struggling most. And there are going to be children struggling with mental health issues. There are going to be children struggling with going back into the world and into the classroom. There are going to be children who aren't struggling at all. But I think that making it okay to say, I'm having a hard time with this, and providing help and support to those children and families is kind of part of our assignment. If, indeed, as we all hope, we're lucky enough to be getting our world back. And as Dan said, the other part of that is trying to make it a somewhat different and more thoughtful version of the world as we get it back.
Right. And we should keep in mind, by the way, that, these systemic inequities, including in the education and health of children, are very much exaggerated and exacerbated by what we've been going through. It's been quite stark, the difference in the experience of some children in urban public schools versus wealthier children in suburban private schools. It just could not be more stark. And that certainly extends also to problems like depression and anxiety. And we have to face that, we have to face it. And again, maybe that will be a hidden blessing of the pandemic, that it's made everything so stark. And, we just have to hope that we can learn from that.
Perri, do you have any final words you'd like to share with us?
I would agree. And I would say that pandemics show you the stress points. They show you who's most vulnerable. They also, though, remind us of something, which, to come back to the theme of the book, they remind us that if we can find common ground in vulnerability, there is a possibility to build on that structures which are stronger for everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And everybody, I think Heather has put the link to buy the book in the chat. Just a little reminder, Mother's Day is coming up, so this book might be a good gift for that. Thank you all so much. And thank you everybody for joining. I think we had almost 200 people RSVP'd for this. So this is a wonderful discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.